Hey everybody, welcome back. This is episode 5 of Creating Creative Chaos. And what I was going to do today is in my last episode, I was talking a little bit about realism and why you would want to do it, why it's important, et cetera, et cetera. And also how um, doing it early on in the process is important if you want to have a really realistic story, just because you have to do a little bit of research to do that correctly. Um, and also, how realistic stories tend to be more popular in less fraught times. Because again, if you've got a very high tension story, people aren't really going to want to do that if their lives are high tension. Especially if they're using it for some sort of escape, like I think most people are that are reading fantasy and science fiction. But I want to take another run at that because I think actually it's not so much important to, if you're talking about that kind of gritty realism, um, I think that's something that we still have as humans over the AI. I think we can still do that, at least for now, better than like artificially generated stories and images and things like that. But I think what's actually more important than the realism, that kind of grittiness, and especially if you want to really have a story that resonates, is having it hold together logically. So, I don't care if you have a story that's not realistic at all. If it doesn't hold together logically, then quite frankly, it's going to be mediocre, I think at best. Um, and how do you do that, especially when you're talking about science fiction and fantasy, which again is largely divorced, or in large part divorced from reality, or separated from it. Well, I think you do that by basically just putting yourself into the the main character or whoever you're talking about and deciding how they or the society or whatever is in the story would react logically to the scenario that you've created in your story. Um, so I'm going to use Star Wars because a lot of people love it as a way of kind of talking about how maybe one or comparing and contrasting two Star Wars movies to how ones that do hold together logically and ones that don't. And I think episodes, especially 1 and 2 with Star Wars, are kind of quite rightly known as perhaps some of the worst ones that are out there. And the reason that they're like that isn't because that their story is markedly different from any of the other Star Wars stories, but it's because it logically doesn't make much sense for a lot of the stuff that's going on. Um, if you have a giant droid army, why are you going to line it up and charge at each other like people were doing back in, the Greek city-states, the Peloponnesian War and stuff, especially if people are shooting each other with, laser guns? It doesn't logically make any sense, does it? Um, why are you going to have some insane creature called Jar Jar jumping around like a maniac, like he's on crack or something, uh, just doing silly crap in the middle of a battle? It doesn't make any logical sense. Now, again, a lot of this is because we're not here to actually see a realistic battle, but you have to have it on a continuum. And if it's so far in the silliness, then it's not going to make for a good story or a good movie. I think you've got a little more freedom if you're doing a video because again, you can distract people a lot with special effects, but you don't really have that much that luxury. I think if you're writing, um, so I think if you're a writer, you definitely need to make sense that what you're doing it fits in that sort of logical framework. So let's contrast that with, say, Rogue One, which is arguably one of the best, if not the best, Star Wars movie. And the reason that it holds together so well is because it's gritty, but it's also pretty logical. I mean, when you think about it, the first Star Wars movie, which ends up being Episode 4, came out. It doesn't make any sense to have like a gigantic space station that can be blown up with like two little shots. And then what Rogue One did is it actually kind of addressed that issue, tied together the first trilogy and the second trilogy, and showed you why. And then also, because it was very brutally logical, a lot of people ended up dying to make it work. It was still escapist, but again, the story held together because you could see the reasoning behind what everybody was doing. Um, it's still science fiction, so the realistic aspects of it, you weren't really there, and quite frankly, you don't really need it there as long as your story holds together logically. So I think I would step back from saying, like, if you want to have the first thing to do is actually think about what story you're trying to tell and kind of map out in your head. And I don't care if you have to do that with a outline or whatever, how things are logically going to progress through it. And if you're like me, you're just kind of doing it from the seat of your pants. The way I do it is basically by putting myself in the character while they're in that situation and thinking, given what they know, how they would logically react to what's happening. And I honestly would say that, a lot of the mechanics of writing, sitting down, typing away, doing all that, or, they'll come to you with practice. But you also need to mentally practice and consider and make a very strong point of whenever you start a story to make sure that it logically holds together. Because when it doesn't, the quality drops off quite rapidly. Another example is Game of Thrones. Some of the battles that they had in the later the seasons of Game of Thrones just didn't make any sense. And you don't have to be a strategic genius to realize that having your light horse charging madly into spears doesn't make any sense. And again, I think this is something that Hollywood perhaps suffers with because they rely over much on special effects. And let's face it, artificial intelligence is going to do special effects better than we will at this point. So we've got to maximize the things that we still have in advantages, and that's actually making sure that our stories logically hold together and give us that little grit that will make our work stand out from stuff that's generated by a machine. So yeah, I've been thinking about that. I'm going to go ahead. I think I've talked about that enough. I think next episode I'm actually going to start going through Reluctant Regent, and what I'll do is I'll actually put the story up on the screen and I'll read through it. So if you don't want to spend money on an audio book or on the paper book, you could probably just subscribe to this podcast and get the same material. And I'll go through and I'll read through it. And not only that, I'll actually stop and start talking about things that why I describe things the way I did, why I made the choices I did in the story, and maybe give you my thought process as we go through it. Try to do maybe, I don't know, 5, 10, maybe a chapter an episode, and go through it that way. Okay, so I think we've gotten all the preliminary stuff out of the way. Next episode, we're actually going to get into the meat of Reluctant Regent and start going through how I wrote the book and the processes and the challenges and things like that I ran into. Okay, so everybody have a good day, and I will see you probably in a couple weeks. Bye.